Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Am reading video for Friday, February 20th, 2026, going up on a Saturday. So far, so good, keeping with this, tradition of, well, this is my second time keeping on top of it. And today, I don't have the sun streaming into my face, which is probably in good part because it is a rainy, gloomy day outside in the DC area today, so at least it's not snowing. The snow is slowly leaving. But anyway, here we are at the end of the week, but I actually still do have to get to work and all that good stuff. So hopefully I can, get to the point and keep things a little short and sweet, although I have a little more to share this week than last. So anyway, I'm going to start with a new literary journal, because in these Am reading videos, I read and review short stories from American, usually literary journals. And I am now starting Ploughshares. This is the spring 2025 edition. And so, well, before I talk about the story, I will mention that the fiction editor wrote a tiny introduction which intrigued me. But then, all she said about literature, like she basically started with, these are, troubling times and we need literature. And then she just gave sort of a really broad, generic account of what she thinks makes good literature, which after reading the Bass introduction last month, it just, it was a little disappointing because at least Celeste Ng and all of the guest editors actually summarized the stories and what speaks to them there. And anyway, so I guess it's a good time for me to jump into my own review of a short story, then, the first one in this collection, which is called Little by C.B. Anderson. And this is a pretty quick little story, although the title is Little because that is the nickname of the main character. She lives and works on a lobster boat, and she basically her family has a long history going from her great-grandfather of lobstering, and it's a largely male business, and most of the present-day action is her one of her employees, who's a man, continuing to talk to her to say that she's using the wrong type of bait. And she's taking, offense to this because she's in the business, she has the family tie, she knows what she's doing. And she actually, at one point, as he's talking, she pushes him and he falls overboard, which is an accident, although I do. And I think maybe I go into my own biases a little with that because, I feel like some stories tend to try to justify that sort of behavior and, there's always righteous reasons to justify this sort of behavior, but it just, never stands up to me. But, the rest of the story is, much more compelling. She talks about her brother who's moved away to a city and talking about her. She talks about being worried about disappointing her father and basically how difficult it is to be a woman in such a male-coded field, which is why she, puts on a cap and calls herself Little, even though at the end of the story we realize her or learn her full name is Elizabeth. So yeah, it's a little slice of life about what it's like for a woman in a male-dominated industry, which I appreciated. Speaking of short stories, I also read This Is What America Looks Like. This is a small press publication from the Washington Writers Publishing House. It's an anthology of DC, Maryland, and Virginia writers. I made a whole video about this, and I particularly highlighted these 5 stories, which spoke to me. A lot of the stories in here and what this press favors is microfiction, much like, the story I just read, where usually I gravitate more toward fuller fiction. But yeah, it's an interesting collection. I feel like it definitely has a small press feel. It gives you something a little off the beaten path. And I've had this on my shelves for years in that corner, so I'm so glad I finally got to reading it. And I will link to the video I made down below. Next, I'll move on into poetry. This is Forest of Noise by Mosab Abu Toha. He is a Gazan poet, and I just read this collection with my Israel book club at my synagogue, and we went through some of our feelings, and we read some of the poetry aloud. And it's very visceral poetry. I think, we have some members in our community who are really tapped into the literary world, especially in Israel. And I think, at least going from what she said, Israeli poets also are, jazzed up about Mosab Abu Toha, who this collection he wrote during the recent war, which was devastating for him and his family. They lost their home, they lost family members. He was writing a lot of this on the run. It's very visceral and disturbing stuff, and there's just a lot in here on a universal level that can really speak to you just about the horrors of having to live through something like this, and also, how this is an ongoing conflict, and that there's a lot of history that's engendered and, has played a huge part in the present as well, and a lot of narratives there too. So that's a lot that's going on. And then there's also just stuff that, speaking from the perspective of somebody who's been embroiled in October 7th and the community there, there's some interesting and really disturbing parallels. So I thought I might read one poem. This is Ramadan 2024, and honestly, I guess to me, this jumped out to me the most because, you could possibly, substitute this for Passover 2024, because a lot of the imagery in this poem matches things that have been happening in the Jewish community with the hostages and the missing and dead. So anyway, this is the poem. Around that dinner table, missing are the chairs where my mother, my father, and my little sister used to sit with us on Fridays, and where my siblings and their kids used to drink tea at sunset when they visited. No one is here anymore, not even the sunset. In the kitchen, the table is missing. In the house, the kitchen is missing. In the house is missing. Only rubble stays, waiting for a sunrise. So I'm really glad and grateful I have had a chance to read this. And, I don't read a lot of poetry, and I don't read a whole lot of Palestinian writers, so I'm very grateful I had this chance. The next book I haven't finished yet, although I'm very close. This is The Magnificent Esme Wells by Adrienne Sharp. It's a book, I feel like, it feels very familiar to me because I've had it on my shelves forever, and I've played with it in my TBR game a lot. And finally it got to the top of my Goodreads TBR, so I'm picking it up and enjoying it more than I thought I would. And I do think I'm around 75% finished, so I'm pretty sure I understand the general gist of the story. This is actually a dual narrative. Part of it takes place in the late 1930s in Hollywood, and then the next part takes place in the late 1940s to early 1950s in Las Vegas, which at the time was being just starting to be built up as, the extravaganza that it is today, with the hotels that were very much started by gangsters and their associates. And that's what Esme's father is. She grew up as the daughter of this gambler and sort of small town crook, and then her father, and then her mother was a dancer, wannabe actress in Hollywood who never quite made it, and actually died when Esme was pretty young in the first timeline. And then she and her father ultimately make it to Las Vegas, where he is working with Bugsy Siegel to put together the Flamingo Hotel. So those things are actually real. There's a lot of real name dropping in here of mobsters and politicians and figures like that. Esme and her family, and I think her lover ultimately, are fictional, but so many other people are real. And I found this really engrossing. There's just a wonderful level of detail. And there's something interesting in here where I feel like there's things I quirk my eyebrows at. Like, well, one thing, I think one of the reviews of this book pointed out is that Esme has absolutely no education. And this is told in first person, and it probably sounds too intelligent for someone who can barely read. Just to put that out there. But the other thing is that part of me grates against the fact that Sharp, I think, puts Esme Wells into situations where she's like, a sweetheart of all sorts of famous people, from Bugsy Siegel to an actual famous Nazi sympathizer who, came to the German Bund to, prop up Hitler at the time of the 30s. And And here's Esme, who is, ridiculously in this place, and she has blonde hair, so, there's the irony, of course, that he's propping her up as the Aryan child who needs to be saved, and I'm rolling my eyes a little. But at the same time, I feel like I'm forgiving Sharp for a little bit of this, because she's saying such interesting things about the character. Like, even in the scene where she's brought up to this Nazi rally, it really turns into something about Esme and her desire for fame, which, is obviously born out of this, her formative experiences with her parents. And then there's just other things in here about what it means to be a woman in the society where you're a little girl to maybe a young teenager where you're kind of protected, but then, you get into a space where, the mobsters who were protecting you are starting to groom you and be predatory to you. And certainly this sort of thing might be on everybody's minds more often today, even just because of the Epstein files and what's happening there. But I think it's a much more universal thing for a lot of women in these male spaces as well. So I just thought, there's some really interesting commentary on how it impacts Esme. Really interests me. So I'll check back with how her story definitively ends. And the final book I'll talk about here is Jesus Wept, 7 Popes and the Battle for the Soul of the Catholic Church by Philip Shenon, which, as the subtitle indicates, is going to take a look back at like 70 years of Roman Catholic history, going through the 7 popes that were in charge during that time. And that's all I'm going to say about this right now, in part because technically I haven't started listening to it yet because I'm waiting to finish Esme Wells, but also because I am reading this book for the BookTube Prize. So the BookTube Prize was started by Robert Sheard back in 2019 as a way for the literary bookternet to come together and judge the best of literary fiction and nonfiction published in English in the US the year before. So we are currently judging 2025 releases. The BookTube Prize takes place over several months. We have 4 rounds where we whittle down a long list until we finally get to, winners and runners-up in the fiction and nonfiction categories. I am reading for this our first round of 2026 from Nonfiction Ballot G. And so I'm pitching this book against the 5 others to decide which ones I want to advance to the next round. And otherwise I have to zip my lips so that I don't influence my fellow judges. But if you'd want to hear my preliminary thoughts about my ballot or get more information about the BookTube Prize, those links are listed down below. And that about covers it for me now. As I sit here rambling, I'm never quite sure how much time elapses, and then I finally get to editing and I realize that I've rambled on and on. So anyway, hopefully you got something interesting out of all of this. I will be back on this channel in the near future with my author's backlist video. It's a project that I meant to, wrap up in December, but instead I started in December and I'm wrapping up hopefully now this month with reading some Michael Cunningham books and comparing them to each other. So stay tuned for that. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend coming up ahead. I know in the US we don't have a 3-day weekend this time. In fact, I don't think most of us get one again until May, but hopefully we'll make do with what we have and the books will keep on flowing. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.